Hello, I'm here with Ovidiu Ţichindeleanu. I'm pronouncing it right?
Yes.
Whom I mostly know as a translator, but he's a prolific scholar in his own right. And we're going to talk today about a lot of stuff, mostly about colonialism and decolonialism in regards to Eastern Europe and internationalism, hopefully, which is why we are talking in English, in my Iliescu English, as it has been described.
That's a good one.
Yes. As I said, I mostly know of you as a translator. I've read Caliban and the Witch, Introduction to World Systems, How to Understand the World by Wallerstein, and Jason Hickel's The Divide, which all of them I really loved. I was engrossed by them, and they helped me understand the world by I don't know, bringing a lot of clarity to things about the world system, basically, and our history, and the history of capitalism, and how it's connected with colonialism. I've noticed you were active in the Romanian intellectual left scene. Sadly, before I was really following it. What I could have seen, about 2007, 2015-ish, 2014-ish.
Even earlier, 2000.
Even earlier.
1, 2.
I'm talking about the kinds of articles I found.
Well,
so
a big part of some of the articles that I guess with which I started are not online, because a lot of them were on the Romanian Indie Media platform, and which was this group that started in 2004, but actually earlier than that, and then between 2004 2009-ish, it became quite a big platform. So as big as Critic Attack had become at in its heyday. And Indie Media was an anti-capitalist platform, and I published a lot of articles there together with the other comrades. But the Indie Media servers were illegally raided in London and then in Germany by the FBI, and those archives are not available anymore due to this act of censorship. So that's a part that of I guess the history of the local history of the left that unfortunately has been kind of erased. And I'm trying actually these days to write a short article about it, but as with all these things, I guess a collective effort would be needed to kind of bring back all the debates and the actions, because that platform was not only just diasporic intellectuals and local activists debating on radical democracy, anti-capitalism, and all that, but it was linked to a series of actions. The first Lady Fest organized in Timișoara, footnote bombs, and of course the protest against the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2007, which ended simply with repression. And actually that kind of spelled also the end of that activist intellectual wave, because, it just ended with a beating.
No, yeah. Interesting. Whenever you think about the FBI intervening in left spaces, it's something usually placed in the past. It's something they used to do, but
there's always surprises, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, those were the years in which, I guess the mainstream culture industry in Romania was dominated by two sides, basically. The conservatives and then the liberals, kind of like in a North American fashion. And both these sides, which hated each other, or, at least, they had debates. Both of these sides were complicit in supporting the wars of invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan. they were also complicit in silencing the existence of that secret interrogation facility that was organized apparently somewhere on the Ottopan airport, and which, it was recognized in Haga. The existence of that thing was recognized at Haga, but the Romanian authorities denied it, and I think they are denying it until now. And so Indymedia was one of the few places where voices expressing suspicion or criticism, or anti-war positions could be openly published. It was an open publishing platform, which means that it had a collective. We were, I guess, the collective itself was formed in about a year of discussions. It was transparent, and all the discussions were available online, actually. And then people would simply publish themselves. There was a button on the platform, publish yourself, and then they would publish. And we would intervene only if the articles were, if they were, we had some principles. If they were racist or misogynist or promoting some marketing, some commercial things. And that was the platform.
Interesting, and said that it's it got ended in the way it was. I was going to start the main topic of discussion by explaining why we're talking in English.
Well, I mean, talking in English is important to reach, including a regional audience, right? And also, it's kind of honest to talk in English, given, I don't know, my own formation. For instance, I left Romania in '99. Of course, I returned every year, and a migrant always returns. But the English that I speak, if your English is Iliescu's English, my English is the migrant's English. It's definitely not her queen's English. And so this English has been a tool of communication in regional comrades, in the Balkan Social Forum, for instance, in 2011 and 12, and with other comrades in Africa and Latin America. So the English that we're speaking is just a tool, and our accents are also important.
But I think the notion of anti-imperialism, anti-war especially, and not only anti-war, but the militarized response to the European borders, I think these are very good ways to start talking about colonialism and decolonization and what they mean for us in the Eastern Europe.
And so, I don't know.
Okay, so let me unpack this by explaining how we are usually talking right now about this subject, and how I see it being discussed even by some Western leftists. In our case, it's mostly put in relation to the European Union, not usually to the United States.
Right.
The European Union seen as an empire, expressedly. Mm-hmm. An empire, a totalizing empire, a block, a concrete block without idiosyncrasies, without contradictions, without any sort of plurality of voices inside it. Mm-hmm. So it's this concrete block that colonizes us with its language, its institutions, its businesses, of course, and its concerns. In practice, for example, in leftist circles, a lot of the debate surrounding social justice is seen as an act of colonization. So concerns about people of color, about queer people, these are seen as an act of colonization, an act that doesn't concern Romanian people. I think the only intellectual tradition, European intellectual tradition that seems to be recognized is the Enlightenment, both by people on the left and people on the right. Everything else is corrupted by some interest. And we should develop our own intellectual traditions and critiques in our own language. This is how colonialism is described. Of course, there are also some leftists more aligned with the former Soviet Union. Okay, so they talk about it in very, I don't know, even Leninist terms, anyway, similar, like proposing the European Union and the Americans and the United States as imperial blocs and so on.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I come from a different tradition. I mean, yes, indeed, this is how recent, how colonialism has been talked about. But I see this as a recent wave that started, let's say, after 2008. So after the global crisis of capitalism. For my part, as all throughout this formation, it was my formation as intellectual and diasporic worker, I tried to build, to archive the cultural history of Romania and of Eastern Europe in transition. And in this concrete cultural history that that formed us after '89, for me it was very clear that a very important factor were what I call the self-colonizing intellectuals and officials. So I started talking about not about colonialism, but about colonization and self-colonization. And yes, I referred that to material phenomena, the way the industry had been, including the industry, had been fragmented and then sold, but also to ideological phenomena, how the whole cultural sphere was basically recreated almost from zero after '89, following a Western Western models. Not only one, because it always had. You know how Chomsky talks about the manufactured consent that always has opposing poles, but the issue is the frame, which is very narrow, which accommodates those opposing poles. Something like that, I think, happened also in Romania and in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland for sure. And so that was the phenomenon of self-colonization that I started protesting about. And that had a very specific forms, like, it was related to EU, but only in very specific forms. I mean, the Eurocentrism of politicians and intellectuals and journalists, so people from that composed the public sphere after '89, was almost universal, like every East European country started looking only towards its west, and then kind of like as if the Iron Curtain moved towards each neighbor's east, So that, for instance, Hungary didn't know anything about Romania, Romania didn't know anything about Moldova, Moldova didn't know anything about Ukraine, and so on and so forth, So the eyes turned exclusively towards the West. So I think this kind of Eurocentrism is undeniable. I mean, it's archived and it was related to the EU in a monolithic way up until the integration waves, right? So after Romania and Bulgaria were entered into in the EU, the European Union, only afterwards you could see, and of course it was predictable, that you could see some criticisms related to what the European Union is. Is it a right project in the actual form? Is it a left project? And it was around the debates on the constitution of the EU that those criticisms kind of appeared, but they were very timid and shy. And still, I think to our day, you have this predominant Eurocentrism that basically defines kind of like the soil of the public sphere. Now, after the global crisis of capitalism in 2008-9, And after the protests against neoliberalism in Romania from 2011-12, and then, with all the crisis, the global crisis having effects in Eastern Europe, what you could totally see the right borrowing themes and subjects from the left that traditionally belong to the left tradition. And one of these things was all the talk about colonialism. And it was predictable that this would happen, because the Eurocentrism of the 2000s was so aggressive that it was bound to have kind of like a counter-reaction. But the counter-reaction came from the conservative right. The same, and it's actually a continuation. Like, for instance, with Orban, the moment he started talking about the imperialism of the colonialism of the European Union, all that stuff, well, I mean, he was not contradicting himself, only in a superficial manner. Yes, he was the exact same person who in the 90s was the most Eurocentric of the new wave of East European politicians, And yes, now his discourse was kind of like taking a 180, a volta-faccia, like the Italians said. But it actually was consistent with his method, It was basically after the EU integration, we are claiming our own slice of whiteness. That's the turn, right? It's not contesting whiteness as such and colonialism as such, but it's claiming a slice of whiteness. Now we meaning the gang, him and the gang around him, who are to this day kind of like sucking up all the forces of the Hungarian state, and the same thing in Poland, right?
And to prove that he is part of the EU, he doubled down on actions to restrict movement, on violence towards migrants, basically doing the dirty work for the European Union.
Yeah, the same movement was done by the Croatians and by the Polish, so basically assuming this new role of Eastern Europe being the ones with the sticks, building up the walls and stopping the new wave of refugees. And this went all the way to Slovenia, which was the last of the former socialist bloc to actually erect a razor wire fence against the refugees. And again, if you look at the arguments, they are the same as in the pre-EU accession. We are European, we are white, these are not European, they are not Christian, they are brown. And so it's always a racializing argument and a claim to Europeanness and whiteness that is at stake. And that's a continuity from the 90s to the present. So all this anti-colonial talk is definitely not a decolonial talk. It's just a continuation of the same discourse, but set up on the ethno-nationalist soil, as it were. Right.
Even in our case, in Romania, Dragoș Păslaru, a member of the European Parliament, while member of the Unity to Save Romania party, a party seen as progressive and enlightened, during the debates for the elections, he was saying how Romania has to double down on protecting the European borders, and the EU itself has to double down on militarizing the borders. So not only thuggish figures like Viktor Orban are participating in this, but even so-called enlightened figures. And,
this talks again to what I said before, that this new consensus is actually manages to go through opposing parties. So this guy like Dragoș Păslaru is, let's say, a liberal, right? And he carries this discourse. But on the more extreme right, let's say, the conservatives are carrying the same discourse, right? So this is something that is deeper than the superficial divides of the formal political sphere. And that deeper thing is what carries us all along in this new history in which we are, collective history in which we are engaged with, right? And that's why, criticism against this deep direction, I thought was needed from the 2000s, but of course, you have resisting reactions coming both from the right and from the left. And they took different forms, but it's expected. However, I think, the superficiality of the supposedly anti-colonial position of somebody like Orban or the liberals nowadays, I think it's quite obvious, and it doesn't have any connection historically or logically with what is going on. Historically, it completely has nothing to do with the anti-colonial movements, right? And logically, it has nothing to do with the deeper processes that still are making out of the former socialist bloc a semi-periphery of the world, right? They are not countering them, although, I gotta say, some of the policies, nationalist policies, that Orban and the Polish guys have put in place, kind of simply as a sort of like inertia, or let's say collateral effect, they brought a certain resistance, I guess, to all this wave of accepting modernization without any resistance.
In what way? Can you give some examples of the policies?
Well, I mean, for instance, you know how one day I was watching television and I saw our former prime minister from the Social Democrat Party openly saying live on television that yes, some ambassador had called him while he was prime minister and told him that, well, there's this company coming to this mayor, please call him and make sure that everything is fine. And so this happened after the fact, right? After he was prime minister. And so, but he still had the liberty of coming out with this in public, and he never made a scandal, simply because, such a foreign interference is taken somehow for granted, right? If it was an internal thing, let's say some guy from a company in the territory calling him as a prime minister and telling him that, well, if you should talk with the mayor to arrange things, well, that would be called corruption, right? And would be prosecuted. But simply because it was the ambassador, there's no territory, right? So that kind of shit still goes on, but this kind of superficial right-wing resistance to colonialism, at least in Hungary and Poland, made that kind of stuff at least not be out in the open, right? So there's a bit of a resistance to that. So both Orban and the Polish guys are not so, have stopped or at least have limited a little bit, and we have to know more, this kind of direct foreign interference in the economic and social lives.
Now that you've singled out or that you've concentrated on Hungary and Poland, and you mentioned how there's no historic connection between the right-wing so-called anti-colonialism and the original movements. I've recently read an article by you, The Intimate Self-Colonization, tracing back how the current Europhile sentiment can be linked to anti-communism, as to anti-communist ideology.
Yeah,
I remember that Orban and especially PiS in Poland made their stake through anti-communism.
Yes, I mean right from the beginning, as soon as January 1990, you had both Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel, when they go to the US and speak in front of the reunited chambers, both of them talk about, it's not only that they criticize socialist totalitarianism, but they do much more than that. They basically claim that US is the land of freedom and basically the positive, the mystical positive realm that everybody was looking for after '89. So basically their anti-communism, expressed in those moments of paradigmatic transformations, already took not only the negative form of distancing from one's own past, but of embracing something else. And that something else, of course, was free market and everything that has come with shock therapy and all those impositions that right now cannot simply be justified by any economic scientists, right? There's no economic reason to justify shock therapy if you look comparatively in the region and across regions. That kind of sufferance and destruction and devalorization is simply unjustifiable, both in economic, in its own terms, so economic, and of course in ethical and political terms. It was a destruction and a devalorization that was basically made possible by this new, I guess, ideological principle of anti-communism, which did not mean only criticism of state socialism, but a radical departure from the historical experience of socialism, and at the same time embracing a completely new other, right? And that other had a concrete geopolitical sense, right? It was the West, and it was particularly then US of A. Anti-communism, I think, was kind of like, the platform or the door through which you have all the new dominant ideologies enter, Like again, neoliberalism was common both to liberals and conservatives after 89, right? Including the Social Democrats have adopted neoliberalist policies, right? There's differences in between them, of course, but across the board, they've adopted neoliberalism, right? And that was made possible also by the general anti-communism, right? In spite of the claims of the formal political right that, communists have never gone, that claim that securiștii sunt de vină, that communists are to blame for any backwardness that Romania still has, right? That kind of claim is a permanent claim. Once it was put in place already in January 1990, it stayed there because it's the new fundamental ideology that makes possible everything, or moves like a tectonic plate everything else.
Even today, there's hardly any sort of opposition to our main social democratic party, so-called, that doesn't claim that they are communists, and that every victory against them is a victory against the Red Plague.
The Red Plague, exactly. Yeah. Yes. And that, of course, makes a lot of things impossible. Like, makes impossible having a real discussion about left policies in the formal political sphere, right? There has been, thus far, after 30 years, no real discussion. I mean, Iliescu tried at some point, but, there's been no real debate on the public sphere of what could be left politics, if of any kind, if it's valid in the region, right? And also it made impossible, it did something that I think on a human level is very simple to understand, in the same time it's so sad. It's this kind of absolutist anti-communism made people devalorize themselves, in the sense that, when the historical experience of our mothers and fathers and grandparents is completely dismissed, is thrown out to the dustbin of history as being irrelevant and bad.
Or simply nostalgia towards their youth.
Yeah, that does something to our possibilities of, being in our history. The experience of socialism would have to be taken with all the bad and the good things, Both nostalgia is kind of keeping it as a monolith, and anti-communism is also relating to it like towards a monolith. And we have, after 30 years, and socialism lasted 45 years, right, or something like that in Romania. And we are 30 years after that, and we've still not have, there's very good work that is being done and has been done, but I don't think we had on the public sphere a real debate on the legacy of the historical experience of socialism that we could build on, right? Something that, and that's really weird because, if you look around, after 30 years, most of the infrastructure and basically all of the cities of Romania have been built in socialism. Then again, if you look at the curricula in school, you see that most of these curricula, or a very significant part of it, has been of this cultural, what we call the Romanian culture, right, has been produced during socialism. So there's it's all over around us. We have all these resources that, we can relate to them both without this kind of overwhelming nostalgia, but also without putting them into that kind of museal place of bad things,
In terms of what's studied in primary and high school, there's I think an equilibrium between what's been produced under socialism and what's the interbellic period. There's a great nostalgia for the interbellic period, but even what was produced under socialism, we are studying those works that are so abstract that they don't really matter from an historical sense, or they look towards the past. The best example, I think, is Marin Preda's Moromeții.
Yes, yeah.
And which we in school we are studying precisely the first volume, which is prior to the instauration of the communism, and not the second volume.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's completely ignored the second volume. I mean, not completely, since now we have a movie about it.
Yeah, and the movie, to my understanding,
yeah, I mean, it pushes it, but it pushes it in a bad manner. I mean, you can still be anti-communist and smart.
Yeah, of course.
But it's bad. Yeah. What this kind of agenda, like we're putting only the first volume of Moromeții and discussing it as if it landed from space, without context, it's really bad. Like, for instance, why not talk about Moromeții in dialogue with Vara Baroc? You know Vara Baroc?
No.
It's a novel by this literary critic, Paul Georgescu, who was one of the smartest guys in the branch. And at some point he decided to become a writer, which as a literary critic is clearly sort of a significant gesture. And so he decided to do this by writing a different kind of Moromeții, right? He was an urban figure, but he wrote Vara Baroc as both sort of like a satire, but it's a very smartly disguised satire. So anyway, it's kind of like a replica to Moromeții, a replica written by an urbanite, but it still happens in a very provincial city that he imagines, and in the Bărăgan also. And well, I think a discussion that would take Moromeții and the other socialist literature around it would be way more helpful or useful somehow for our times than just continuing to take these works and discuss as if they are, I don't know, stars in the sky, completely outside any constellation,
Yeah, what I think made me not quite hate, but not appreciate the literature we were taught at school at its full value was this complete lack of context. I didn't know anything about the time periods, the political contexts, the historical context, and so on.
Yeah, even Nikita Stănescu, I mean, you put him, and I mean, every couple of years, right, you still have either Stănescu or Preda or Bacovia, right, at the back as subjects. And
or fairy tales.
Or now it's true. Yeah. Nowadays is this. I guess this is pushed by nationalism more. But still, this kind of modernist literature that was produced during socialism, I still think remains kind of like the implicit standard of high culture, whatever high culture means, that is taught to kids nowadays, right? So, but that without analyzing the context. It's the same thing like, like a couple of years ago, I was at the Bikaz, the big dam, and there was a group of tourists from Denmark, and I got in talk with them, and they completely had no idea that this was built under socialism. They completely assumed that this was something that had been built now, because socialism equaled poverty and nothingness, basically, for them, right? And they were just flabbergasted because they had a discussion amongst them because they saw the years, and they were like, well, Romania was socialist then, right? And they were kind of befuddled and like, well.
It's funny that this happened to people from a so-called social democratic country.
Yeah, but ignorance goes a long way. And the projection of the external projection of socialism. I mean, we're not talking only about anti-communism as an internal thing. Of course, this kind of deep ideological separation was projected on the global scene, just like the Romanian Revolution was basically the main subject of all the news agencies of the world in December '89. I really see it in the same way with these new ideological tectonic plates like anti-communism. The West itself learned to see this former socialist bloc in a new way. And there's a book by Andaluna Borcilă, who is also a diasporic intellectual. She's based in the US, and she analyzed very meticulously how the French, German, US, but especially US television started presenting images about this, opaque realm behind the Iron Curtain that was opening right now. And she clearly documents how the first new ways of presenting visually and then talking about the socialist bloc were basically tropes that had been used in the US press, for instance, to talk about the so-called third world, right? So you had the poverty, the sick children, and the condition of the women. But it was very invasive, right? And so this kind of new image was happening at that time of paradigmatic transformations, when the first ways of presenting are so influential that they basically are stuck with you maybe for a few decades or even more. And so this kind of refiltering of the socialist bloc outside on the global scene for sure was felt also in Scandinavia, which sent a lot of ajutoare, aid in '89 to Romania, and for which, yes, socialism was, East European socialism was equal to backwardness and poverty, sick children, and gray, and the color gray.
Mm-hmm. And because these kinds of images have such a reception in the West, we learn to see ourselves like that.
Yeah, it's at some point I call that, for instance, the Romanian American view, because basically what happened after '89, that this kind of paradigmatic political shift coincided with this technological shift, the cable television and the satellite dish, right? All that technology was developed in the late '80s and had its real explosion in the '90s. And so you have in Romania this explosion of cable TV already in the first half of the year 1990. So, for instance, I remember watching, I had already, I think in March or April 1990, or something like that, we had cable TV. And we had one Romanian channel, TVR, TVRL, it was still the free Romanian television. And then we had 3 German channels, Sat.1, ProSieben, and RTL. And then we had a few English, a few French, 1 Hungarian, and 3 or so Italian, right? And so it was very interesting, of course. So just like me, other people from worker neighborhoods in Romania, learned to look at things through that kind of image that was presented on those Western channels. And you could see, and I documented this kind of literary form that was very common in the press of the time, editorials or articles which were written like this. I saw yesterday on television on this channel that in France and this and that. And then the moment came, but here things are not like that. They are bad, they are this.
We have a sort of recurring rubric where we read Cristian Tudor Popescu's editorials that are done in these precise formulas, and we mock them because they are ridiculous.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a dominant cultural form by now, and nobody kind of asked, wait a minute, you are comparing, first of all, media images to reality. And then, it's the terms of the comparisons are clearly hierarchical. You invested with valuing, the word afară. The word afară, even though it should be like 360 degrees, it was clearly referring only to the Western world. Afară became synonymous with afară e mai bine. Cum e afară? How is afară, outside? It's good. It's not nu ca la noi. It's not like here. And so the language itself the common language, the daily language went through this slow process of filtering and reorientation. And so you had cultural forms, but you also had a way in which, regular people, everybody basically, including myself, went through this transformation.
Yeah, to go back a bit, when you mentioned that you can do anti-communism in a smart way, I think this is one of the grave wounds that the current anti-communist ideology is doing, in that it promotes the fact that there's only one way to criticize the former existing socialism, and it was the one developed by the liberals or the conservatives. So it ignores the various left traditions of criticizing state socialism, and we as leftists have may fall into a trap and embracing this worldview by ignoring the history, basically.
Well, I mean, for myself, there's a few kind of like red flags that make my ears perk, when I talk with the leftist comrades from the global scene, let's put it this way, and they refer to the East European experience. And usually those are the words like distortion, deviation, so basically adjectives that describe, without going into analytical detail, whatever happened in Eastern Europe as, something that does not speak to the true Marxism or to the true letter of historical materialism, right? So that's kind of like a common way in which the global left has managed to ignore the socialist experience of Eastern Europe, and which is, I think, also replicated now internally not now, but it's been replicated in the past decade also in Eastern Europe itself. So basically through appeals towards a more authentic Marxism or historical materialism. That is all well, and I kind of support the spirit of this kind of criticism, but not the actual critique, because I still think we need to have an appreciation in positive terms somehow of the socialist experience in order to move forward with our own history. And so there's plenty of people who do that also, but it's not, by far, it's not the dominant way in which the left still, the global left, let's put it this way, still talks about Eastern Europe. And I include here people like Zizek and Badiou, so very influential grand figures, right? There's many others. Wallerstein, for instance, always learned, or at least always listened to Eastern Europe. So he's a very different figure, which was one of the reasons why I decided to translate him, right? And there's many others. Also Federici, she always listens to him. But I still think this is something, work to be done to, first of all, kind of separate between, let's say, the level of governmental socialism, the policies and whatever, the big institutions, and then the life socialism took on ground level, because you cannot reduce, for instance, whatever was going on in Caminele Culturale, in the cultural houses that were supported and developed all throughout Romania, right? And which took a life of their own in the late 70s and beginning of the 80s, right? So you cannot equalize or identify that with the state policies. Also, there were opposite directions within the socialist governments, The ecological direction, for instance, was very vocal, starting with the mid-60s in Czech Republic, and then in Romania towards the mid-70s and late 70s. And it had concrete effects, right? We are still laughing about, how people were taking their glass bottles in the neighborhood to the recycling place. But now, in post-socialism, we see that, or people see that as a proof of poverty, because, they were taking the bottles to get money for them, right? And they are not seeing this as part of a system that attempted a sort of like ecological transformation of the way socialist life was being managed. Myself, I was born in a worker neighborhood that had solar panels. Our apartment blocks had solar panels that worked. And that was in the 80s in a neighborhood in Cluj. When I say this fact, it seems like as if it's coming from science fiction, right?
Kinda.
Yeah, no, it was there. They were on top of our 4-story blocks. Everybody knows that. And that was, again, part of this systemic attempt to ecologically transform the economy of socialism beyond this model of intensive growth. The triple R's, do you know what they were? Reciclare, so recycling, recuperation, and the third,
recycle, reuse, repair?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So anyway, that was the slogan that was, became, of course, a very annoying thing because in our lives as children, because it was ever present, right? But still, it was a part of this life. And when you bring these things, the depth of anti-communism makes it as if, when you bring this stuff back into discussion, the first reaction that I get is laughter, right? And it's kind of like an uncomfortable laughter. I always ask myself, is it laughable? Yeah, some of these were not working very well. Like our solar panels were not making the water in our apartment hot. They were making it warm, right? Which somehow was good enough. But yeah, they were not working, extraordinarily well. And of course, you can complain about this and that. But the point is that, if we would like to attempt, let's say, an ecological transformation of our current system of organizing economy and society, we don't have to start from zero, There's already existent experiments, people, and resources, that were developed in the 60s, 70s, and to a limited extent in the 80s. And so, we can refer to that. Some people are still alive who dealt with that, but they are forgotten now or thrown into that kind of dustbin of history with their knowledge considered irrelevant. Just because even when talking about ecology now, we have to import stuff or to build something as if from zero. At the level of society, you cannot build anything from zero.
Or as if it's something completely foreign to us, like it's something that wasn't tried here before, that has no sort of tradition here, that is something that either has to be imposed or we have to, magically build the ecological consciousness into the people from whole cloth.
Yeah, I mean, even the talk about moving the capital of Romania to Târgoviște, right? Which was a very well-known thing, and it was almost a rumor that, that kind of urban rumor that was all over the place. But if you look at the sources, at least the ones that I was able to find, this was also part of this kind of ecological project of transformation that understood that huge cities produce enormous waste, and they are, on the long term, they are unsustainable. And the idea was to move towards smaller cities in more ecologically good situations, and also to create chains of value, shorter chains of value between them. So, for instance, all the cities nearby the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, right? The smaller cities that have, let's say, from 50,000 to 120,000 people, including Victoria, right? But on the other side, Târgoviște was also relatively close to that. All those kind of small cities were supposed to be the ecological model of a future socialism, right? But that, of course, is not talked about. Now, the tendency is capitalist metropolis, bringing everything to Bucharest, to Cluj, to Timișoara, to Iași, creating all those hinterlands that have absolutely no chance. Norbert Petrovic has documented very well how the economic rise of the city of Cluj in the past 20 years has also meant an incredible rise of inequality and the production of peripheries, hinterlands in the county of Cluj and actually in the whole region of Transylvania, right? So that, the rising metropolis of Cluj kind of like sucks up and concentrates all the value.
Yeah, and it leaves the rest of the country barren, makes the land cheap, prone to consolidation, helped by European programs such as APIA or AFIR.
Yeah, so this tendency towards metropolis could be contradicted by this other history of going towards smaller cities and shorter chains of value. A metropolis like Bucharest depends on these incredibly long chains of value that bring food to mega image from I don't know where, like sunflower seeds from China and all that kind of stuff, right? So, a metropolis, it's harder to transform also than a shorter city, right? So this kind of tendencies that were systemic, could still be part of the debate, but they are not.
That's interesting. I have a slight interest in urbanism, and it sounds like an avenue of research and investigation. Speaking of peripheries, but first, can we give an overview of what's central and peripheric and semi-peripheric to have a clear view of things?
Well, I mean, if we look at our world and the way it's organized in its global economy and the way societies are organized and the states in between them, this process has been created in a long time, 500 years, let's say, right? And it created metropolitan centers and peripheries, like, for instance, all the Atlantic cities of Europe, including the French ones, accumulated wealth based on the plantations and the slave trade in Caribbean. So that, at the moment of the French Revolution, the biggest source of wealth of the French Empire was the colonized island of Haiti, which produced more than half of the global production of sugar and more than half of the global production of coffee. If you look at Versailles, Versailles was made with that kind of blood money, but also the revolutionaries from Atlantic cities of France, like Bordeaux or whatever, the new middle class emerged out of the same process, right? And so they developed this metropolitan networks and this new modern France as a modern state centered around Paris and centered around the language of Ile de Paris, which at the moment of the revolution was not spoken at all by the people of living in the territory of France. So you had this relation between Paris and Bordeaux and Nantes, and on one hand, and then Port-de-France and Haiti on the other hand. Haiti being the periphery that actually produced the wealth used in the center, in the metropolitan center. Now, Eastern Europe in all this combination had a different role, let's put it this way, right? It wasn't exactly a periphery, but it wasn't also a center. I mean, there were attempts, the Polish kingdom tried its best. Polish-Lithuanians, they never occupied a sort of like a metropolitan role on the global stage, right? Nevertheless, you have institutions that emerge like serfdom, Serfdom coincides historically with the enslavement of black people in the transatlantic trade. And it was all throughout Eastern Europe a form of control of labor that was different than slavery, yet also, negative, let's put it this way. So the relation to of places like Bucharest to Vienna, or Cluj to Vienna, or Bucharest to Berlin or to Paris is a hierarchical relation, but it's not exactly a relation between metropolis and the periphery. It's somewhere in between. And that's why Eastern Europe, it's kind of like, it's a semi-periphery. It takes from both directions. It has both peripheral aspects and it has also metropolitan aspects, especially aspirations. And that kind of ambiguity is something that I think we know and we feel to our bones very well. I mean, I explained it maybe in a complicated manner, but I think once you think about it, it's something that, you feel it, you understand it intuitively, very clear, this kind of double beam in which we are.
Yeah, what I think is very important in this discussion is to keep in mind the historical context and that this is relating to a mode of production that has been developed over time. Instead of just particular political situations, because thinking about the center and the periphery just in terms of the EU as it is now and in Romania as it is now, I think can lead to some wrong conclusions.
Oh, I agree because I think it's completely abusive to think of parts of the former socialist bloc that were integrated into the EU simply in terms of periphery. I mean, for myself, I'm trying to use adjectives like peripheral because we do have peripheral elements, but we definitely play both sides, So that, for instance, Romania always plays the metropolitan side in relation to Moldova. Or, and the same, you go west and is this kind of nested Orientalism, as it has been called. It's, at work in every East European country. So definitely I agree that, we have to be very precise and remember this kind of ambivalence, which is structural. And it has concrete economic forms and concrete ideological forms. Like, including the debate, the Maiorescu debate, formele fără fond. I mean, that embodies precisely the contradiction of, not relating only as a periphery to some central model, but also figuring that, wait, we are in between, neither this nor that. There's a whole discussion to be had about that. Manuela Boatcă has, in this book that we've published last year, she discusses a little bit the Maiorescu debate and the Gherea school as expressions coming from a semi-periphery at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, trying to deal with this relationship between center and periphery in another way.
About a month ago, you moderated a talk by Jason Hickel on global inequality and degrowth. At the end of the talk, there was a small debate, a small Q&A, and you mentioned that he talked a lot about the global south, predominantly about South America, Africa, and didn't really touch on the place Eastern Europe occupies in this global south. The one thing that he said was that, to his mind, Eastern Europe occupies the global south. To make it clear that the global south is not simply a geographical category, it's more complicated than that. But the debate remained a bit in the air, and I wonder what you would have said and added to that.
Yeah, I mean, basically part of my duty since I introduced Hickel to the Romanian scene to also be the first to criticize his blind spot, right? And Eastern Europe is a blind spot, but that is because generally, and this is a struggle that I had in the past decade and more than that, in the discussions among with the global south people, Eastern Europe remains a produced invisibility, right? Or the ways of relating to Eastern Europe are still, undeveloped. And so for myself, for instance, I was to the World Social Forum in Tunis in 2011. And then I created this platform, Eastern Europe and the Global South. And there was a lot of interest. But again, the interest was mostly coming from people from the Global South who had links during socialism to Eastern Europe, right? So former students and that kind of stuff, right? So this discussion, now there's lots of people who are working in this direction, but this comes back again to the question of what are our resources, what are our terms of comparison. If we want to develop or grow in Eastern Europe, and if we admit that, after 89, the whole Eastern Bloc has become sort of like almost a second-rate or semi-periphery of the global centers, then what are our terms of reference? Is it Germany or is it Argentina? So this prompted also me, but maybe others, to explore this idea of trans-peripheral comparisons and connections. For instance, we had all the negotiations with the IMF in the 90s, right? And the shock therapy and all that. And to my knowledge, none of the Romanian people who negotiated, or the Polish or the Czech, even thought of looking at for instance, at the Senegalese experience with IMF in the 80s, right? And their own attempts to bring structural adjustment programs and privatizations and a form of shock therapy. And that's kind of like a very valuable experience that would, I guess, help you in a process of negotiation, right? But the fact that the eyes were turned only towards the East, and not towards the peripheries, kind of precluded that. Also, in this discussion with Eastern Europe as part of the Global South, I mean, it is and it isn't, of course, it's semi-periphery, it's completely implicated in all kinds of things, but some of the things that, again, come from history should be, relearned. Like, for instance, it always strikes me that people only talk about the accession, for instance, of Romania into the EU, right? 2007, it happened. Romania became part of the EU. But nobody asks, well, okay, it entered into something, but what did it exit from? Nobody asks that. And of course, if you look at it, well, it exited from the Group of 77. The Group of 77 was this major alliance at the United Nations of people from the Global South and the Socialist Bloc that was built in the heydays of the anti-colonial movements and the non-aligned movement, and that became very powerful because it, of course, represented the majority of the population of the world. And it was in the times when the United Nations also had significant powers. And the Group of 77 even came with what, to my mind, is still one of the most important alternative proposals to develop, to conceive the global economical system. And I think Jason Hickel mentions it in the book, The Divide. And so Romania was part of that, right? A little part, but it was part of that. It was part of the Group of 77. After the integration into EU, not only this part of the history has been forgotten, but also what it meant in analytical detail. Like, what did that plan presuppose economically and politically, right? Well, it had a lot of things. It had, for instance, it encouraged countries to practice tariffs, to support incipient industries, to protect local incipient industries. So a lot of the things that Jason Hickel talks about when he shows how the first age of development, when the Global South and after the liberation movements actually grew, was left alone, and it actually had success, right? Up until the IMF and the World Bank and the emergence of the neoliberal global system in the 70s, and all the coup d'etat destroyed that. So all that, the policies that they had been using in the Global South had become a general policy and a general economic plan that was supposed to be adopted by the United Nations. And actually it was on the General Assembly of the United Nations, it was adopted as the future of humanity. But then, G7 was formed. And that's part of the other side of history, basically G7, the Western powerful nations, took agency away from the United Nations, made United Nations a sort of like a secondary international board, letting it deal mostly with the relief and the development agencies. But it took the actual political agencies that it had at the level of states, so that this informal, non-democratic structure, which is the G7, which is invitational, right? It's basically the rich inviting powerful at their own table, right? Basically, this took in all its form, G8, G20, it took the agency away from the United Nations. And at the same time, even if that plan was adopted on the General Assembly of the United Nations in 77, it was simply ignored, right? Ignored. And then what we have instead is, of course, the Washington Consensus.
At the end of the division, Jason Hickel proposes some solutions. I think I found them mostly unconvincing on their own terms, even regarding the geographical Global South, and much less so unpractical here. Like one of his solutions was for the Group of 77 to militate for loan forgiveness, which is I don't know. It sounds a bit naive.
Well,
in the sky a bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if this discussion would have been had in the 60s, it would have been very real, right?
Yeah.
A little bit about our own historical times. But what I like is the way Hickel creates the argument for that solution, because part of that argument is showing how all this game of governments asking for loans, people usually imagine it in very abstract terms. But Hickel shows that this is actually what constitutes Wall Street, that all these governmental loans, they basically end up in Wall Street in the form of funds, right? Structured funds. and basically that the gain gives a whole new meaning to Wall Street. So of course, then the solution, asking for loan forgiveness and all that, is basically a political move against Wall Street. And again, it's a matter of political constituency. In theory, that solution, that economic plan, was adopted by the United Nations in 1977. It has not been, annulled or something. So theoretically, we are still we are living it. It's basically what that socialist expression "no inano do mi" was supposed to bring at the global scale. So as long as there's no political agency, of course, that solution is basically, it's an ethical imperative that has no pragmatic possibility. But the thing is that it does this kind of, it has this, let's say, collateral effects, right? I think that having this big claim around makes possible bringing up smaller claims that may be more feasible. For instance, not paying for the usury for loans for a short while, like for instance the COVID crisis, or this kind of smaller negotiation terms that, for instance, Argentina just used this year. And yes, it's a neoliberal government and all that has been using it, but still, it's important to notice that when these kind of arguments are being used by states. And so it is possible on a smaller scale with given the right circumstances. Who knows where will this second wave of COVID lead? I mean, if Wall Street is not a sustainable thing. It's an absurd reality that it's basically where, let's say, all the money is, right? All the money built through centuries of capitalism and colonialism. Let's imagine them metaphorically. Of course, it's not only Wall Street, but basically that's what Wall Street is, right? It's a bag of money. And that money is virtual, and it's all the treasures of the world that have been accumulated there, right? Even if they're not material, even if it's fictional money, but it's there. That's the role of Wall Street, right? And so the only thing that, of course, is needed is political agency to pop that balloon. Right now, we have none. The global left is in one of its weakest states, probably ever, as weak, maybe weaker, certainly weaker than in the 30s, including the very recent history of internationalism so quickly forgotten, like the alter globalist movements of the 2000s, which were actually very powerful in their own way. The World Social Forum, all these things made possible, for instance, for places like the Philippines to be able to defeat the IMF in negotiations, right? And a lot of things they had concrete effects, right? All that history is very quickly forgotten, very quickly. Then the next wave, the Occupy wave, kind of broke away from that the altar globalist movements. And then now we are in a new wave, I guess, with the Black Lives Matter and with Extinction Rebellion. But it's just a beginning, I guess. That was still, crushed by the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything. So for the new wave of social movements and, the global left, it's in a very weak state. It's a very weak state. And also the knowledge. So what we can do is definitely to cultivate this kind of knowledge about the movement themselves and the arguments. So then this kind of big solutions like loan forgiveness in this context, yes, they do sound very far-fetched, but I think they have a political role, not only an economical role. somebody once, I learned from somebody a very interesting thing that, there were all these discussions through which Western liberals were rejecting anything socialist as being not pragmatic. And there was this, I think it was a Swedish socialist, and he said basically something is pragmatic when you have the power. When you have the power, the most far-fetched idea suddenly can be very pragmatic, right? So, the fact that the global left is in a weak situation is definitely related with the fact that the United Nations themselves are lacking political agency to a significant extent, to the fact that the G7 exists. But still, the objective reality is such that even these kind of institutions are under incredible pressures. I mean, if you look at the internal criticism of the World Bank, for instance, it's some of the best socialist economical analysis that you can see. Also, IMF is led right now by a Bulgarian who was formed, had a limited experience, but was formed under socialism. During COVID, she promoted this kind of lenient attitude towards loans, also loans without usury. So things that are not very far-fetched from what Jason Hickel was proposing. And that's the director of the IMF talking, right, and implementing those things. These kind of big solutions are only far-fetched because we are very used with political subservience and not building up our own political agency.
That was the direction from which my objection came. Not that they are his solutions were unpractical or unpragmatic, but we don't have the power to implement them. And how do we build that power? How can we build that power?
Well, I mean, Hickel said something very interesting at one point in the discussion, and it's not on the material, because only his presentation has been put online by the organizers, but in the debate afterwards, he said something very interesting, precisely when I asked him about Eastern Europe. He said that the PIB, the GDP, the national GDP of Romania, is enough for suffices, for a significant or an abundant economy. So that kind of statement made me stop in my tracks, right? Because a part of this ideology of infinite growth, which is related, of course, by the infinite accumulation of capitalism and all that, is that there's no understanding of finitude and of what are not only the limits, but the positive limits that we have. Not only the negative limits, but the positive limits of what we have. And when Hickel says that a GDP that of Romania in the situation in which it is right now could be enough to ensure for the population as a life in plenitude, well, I mean, isn't that the very starting point that we should all refer to, instead of saying, oh, we still need to grow the economy to catch up at least with Hungary or with I don't know whom. Well, saying that we have enough, and then we have to simply look at the way the value chains and the organization of the economy and society is being construed. That's kind of a political project that I think we would have some resonance. Nobody dares to say, everybody complains in politics that they don't have enough money, right? And in reality, when we look, for instance, at the budget of Bucharest as a city or at Cluj, right? They are enormous. And so I would love to see in somebody in the formal political sphere have the courage to say, okay, not that we have enough, maybe not even that, but let's say something like, okay, with what we have, what can we do, right? What can we do with what we already have? That kind of simple statement is completely absent.
There are some studies like the FES, the Frederick Eibachstang Foundation, that organized the talk by Hickel a few years ago, conducted the study on the minimum wage for a family. Indeed, it wasn't about what we can do with our current GDP, but it was on a similar principle, and the reactions towards the study were incredible, from incredibly negative from various right-wing and centrist people. They didn't even let the debate about our productive capacity to unfold. They completely shut the door on that debate even happening.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The political sphere is completely taking up this ideology of growth and infinite accumulation. And we're only talking about finitude. We have not even started talking about decommoditization of social goods, it's not nationalization, but it is decommoditization, which is one of the things that Hickel was also proposing as concrete solutions, and something actually that is absolutely necessary to do if we are to start moving towards a more ecological and more sustainable way of organizing the economy, right? So decommoditizing the energy sector, for instance, or some other things. It's so looking then not, maybe when we talk about nationalization, all of a sudden it's like, everything is just gonna is all that collective property stuff that never worked, and it's bad. But the way Hickel and the other people working on the degrowth paradigm are talking about it, decommoditizing, meaning looking at everything that has been cut in pieces and dragged into the market, and maybe taking it away from the market, right? Deciding, for instance, that, waters are not to be privatized, that biodiversity is an important thing to be cultivated, and so on and so forth. So this kind of move is not only pragmatic, but is absolutely necessary. And that also doesn't happen. So the discussion stops at such an early point, as you said, talking about what we already have and could be enough. Even that is met with stupor. And so this kind of more elaborated, more refined points of decommoditization and short chains of value, short production, consumption chains, all that kind of stuff, it's not even happening as a principle, because the whole discussion is killed before it takes a significant shape.
And one of the reasons this happens, I think it goes towards what we started discussing about, like the ideology of these people, agents of establishing the norms of discussion and the consensus, and their anti-communist instincts and their self-colonization, basically the self-colonization of their imaginary, because the only place where something like putting solar panels on your house that can only happen in the West. This is not something that we are ready for. This is not something we have the capacity for. We have to wait until this happens in the West, and then we can start maybe trying to do them ourselves.
Yep, that's exactly it. Yeah, it sounds. I'm laughing because I find myself laughing because it's laughable, right? But it's the challenge with which we are confronted, and we're gonna be confronted in the next decades or so, until we break this kind of not only mentality but also the institutions that support it. Yeah, it's hard to even open the policy discussion towards something transformative. And I want to say something that also, I mean, this issue of self-colonization, it actually does go very deep, and I thought I understood everything about it in the 2000s when I started writing about it, but I definitely didn't, and I learned a lot along the way because simply knowing about the fact that, let's say, we have been self-colonized or that we self-colonize ourselves, simply knowing about this is not enough to delink from it, you know? It's these are two very different actions of thought and practice. And so it's part of this, our work to try to move criticism itself beyond a criticism of domination and move towards alternative proposals, so positive proposals. That's why for instance, I immediately jumped on translating also Jason Hicken. Yes, some of these ideas, proposals are, as you said, unconvincing and all that. But the idea is that at least he structures his whole research project and his political activity around the attempt to develop solutions, you know? And he has the courage to put it on the table and get rejected. But that's not something that most of the people from the global left do. Most of them tend to be very, let's say, safe in their criticisms and go on and talk about capitalism and imperialism and how things are getting destroyed and all that, without having the courage of centering their own, you know, intellectual and activist work around the solutions, right? And yeah, that's I think kind of like a gesture that still needs to be learned, including by people who want to be critical, right? This wager put on alternatives. Yes, maybe they are not all that. Maybe in retrospect they will prove to be stupid, but we just have to propose these wagers and take that risk, because as we see, you know, the world is not getting better by itself. You know, capitalism is not becoming more human by itself.
Yeah. Now that I think about it, finding out about UBI was a major step in my radicalization, even if I grew to understand the many problems with the UBI, but just hearing about it expanded my horizon of imagination and let me conceive of many other things, of different relationships between personal worth and work, value and work, and so on.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, I mean, on the personal level, I mean, that's one of the most important things, this kind of realization that what we do with our work is always creating forms of value that are not capitalist, but that may end up being recuperated in capitalist or colonial chains, right? But still, what we actually do, there's always resources that we kind of forgot, right? Including this new this other tendency in not only in degrowth but in different directions of post-development, for instance, of looking at what it was called subsistence economies, right? And it was always considered something like an undeveloped form of economy. But actually, these researchers are looking at subsistence economy as the main source, actually, of resistance historically against capitalism. Then looking at the people who constitute this kind of economy, not only rural people, but also marginal urban people, all kinds of people, as the political subjects that already have the knowledge and resources to oppose exploiting relationships, you know, and basically then looking at them as the political subject that has to be organized. It's something that they are doing in, for instance, in Kerala, in India, but not only, in South Africa, in West Africa, in Latin America, and actually also in, to a limited extent, in China, with the rural reconstruction movement. So why not look in Romania also at subsistence? We have 15,000 villages, right? And Florin Poinaru just recently published this article in Critic-Atac about the necessity of a territorial reorganization of the administration in Romania, right? Why not look in Romania at its subsistence economy as the place from which to build up? So not to look down on it, but to build up and create, based on what we have, other kind of relationships between the rural side and the urban side, rurality and small cities, rurality and peripheral neighborhoods and all that.
Not to be completely defeatist, but I think that moment, if not flew by, it will be a lot harder than it was a few years ago, especially harder than it was before joining the EU, because most of the villages are depopulated because of population flight, either internal migration or external migration, and a lot of the people who would have kept the knowledge to participate in the subsistence economy went away, and as I've mentioned, a lot of the properties, their agricultural terrains, their plots of land were sold. Most of them just kept, if they kept anything, they kept a house, a small garden, insufficient, mostly for sentimental value or just to have something to do in the summer. Of course, this is a generalization. There have to be places where this strategy can be applied, but it's hard.
I was led to believe by people who know much more in agricultural studies and all that kind of stuff that actually the revival of a subsistence economy is one of the easiest things to be organized, and that is something that appeals immediately to the also to the political understanding of people who otherwise are not involved in politics. So I'm a bit more optimistic than you, but then again, I know that, for instance, after integration, I don't remember the exact year, but I remember that, for instance, the local council in Bistrița forbade the cultivation of plots in the backyard of apartment blocks because, and I quote, it's not European. So basically, they attacked the subsistence economy, right? On the basis that is not European. And even if that sounds absurd now, I think that kind of spirit is still present. And also the ways in which we have a very limited understanding, for instance, of what the subsistence economy around the cities or in the cities in which we live consists of. What are its chains? What are its main players? What is its potential? We just don't know much. And I wish I would learn more about it.
This is a subject that needs investigated and needs to be reconceptualized, because we have a poor understanding of it, I think. So we talked almost for 2 hours, and I think we're both a bit tired. There's of course a lot more left to be discussed, but I think we can put a lid on it for now. If you have any conclusions or recommendations for resources and or organizations for people to look at or join or whatever.
I mean, I can plug IDEA. I know, with the journal IDEA, we kept on working on this kind of long-term research interests, because the journal itself comes out twice a year, so you cannot relate to political events or to events in general in the same manner as you do in a weekly or in a podcast, So then we kind of established this methodology of working in long-term research interests. And everything is online, including some resources on alternative ways of thinking about subsistence economy, organizing society, left alternatives, all that. But beyond the plugging our own work, yeah, I think we do need a moment of centralization. In spite of everything, I kept on saying, in light of this experience with the Telciu summer school that we did in the village of Telciu with Valer Cosma and Manuela Bot and many others, that basically, we are kind of going through a very interesting period in local criticism. I mean, we've seen amazing social theater being created right now, some very good novels, sociology, critical sociology, anthropology that is remarkable. So, so in spite of everything, we do see the way all these critical forms have emerged is in autonomies, bisericuțe, everybody with their own little church, right? I still think that a general event, I don't know, we used to think also of Critic Attack as a sort of like a bring together platform, but maybe some others have better ideas on how to do this. But I still think that people need a sort of a new platform that would centralize this critical cultural forms, and activist forms, and then the collateral effects could be different than what we have.
Somebody just created the Facebook group with this precise scope, and it's a shitfest.
Of course.
To be a bit serious, when we talked with Costi Rogozanu a few episodes ago, he put the finger on the wound a bit, pointing out that a lot of the conflicts and what's inhibiting a lot of people from joining together and from centralizing their joining together in a common project is the material side. Is that a lot of us have we aren't professionally leftists, we aren't professional critics, we aren't professional revolutionaries. A lot of us have our living staked on various projects, and especially on the academics or cultural people have their positions staked on various sources of finance, from university grants or European projects or AFCN, or even more or less public positions of consulting for various figures and so on, and this material constraint pushes them into various theoretical directions and against consolidating their power with somebody or somebody else.
It's true, but then maybe we have to adjust the time of, the temporal scope of our political agency, because coming back to Wallerstein, he kept on talking about this necessity of looking at two levels politically: long-term interests and short-term interests. And short-term, obviously, everybody, left or right or whatever political color, will push on the necessity of subsistence and food and home and all that. But the way you combine this with longer-term interests, such as undoing capitalism and coloniality, is the way he proposed the long march through institutions. Namely that, we all develop our autonomies, our safe places of work and enjoyment, but all of them, of course, they are precarious, and as Costi said, materially they are vulnerable, and this vulnerability is sooner or later manifested also in ideological options. But what Wallerstein suggested is indeed not selling out, but taking into consideration the institutions that have an existence that goes beyond, let's say, recent history, and trying to work with them. And that's what he called the long march of institutions. And I didn't try it myself, that kind of thing, but there are some experiences that show, that if you have a generation that starts doing this when they are in their 30s, or by the time they are in their 50s, maybe, just maybe, you can have enough of a constituency to actually do something. It's one possible way, but who has time right now, right? The next 20 years, when you don't know if you're gonna be able to pay the bills in 6 months.
I'm grateful for your time, for joining me in this discussion, and I appreciate very much you sharing with us your various histories, your history with the early aughts left involvement, your histories of your alternative histories of socialist Romania, and I think recuperating the history is very important. For to be able to imagine a new future, and I don't know, we keep on struggling.
Yeah, we'll keep on doing the same things, and some maybe this way is the safest way. Thank you for the invitation, and I don't know, let's look forward. Maybe we could talk also about some concrete events next time, because we kept it at a very theoretical level, and we could do also something else.
Sure. So thank you.
Take care.